You were born without a name, without a concept, without any idea of what was right or wrong, beautiful or ugly, acceptable or unacceptable. You were an open field, a blank being, wild, pure, but also defenseless before the world. Then came the others, the words, the conditioned smiles, the subtle punishments, the don't do that, the that's ugly, the good boys don't act like this. The adults arrived with their ready-made truths, inherited values and fears disguised as rules. And little by little, you began to disappear so that an acceptable character could be born. What we call identity is, more often than not, just a set of unconscious strategies we use to be loved and not abandoned. You are not you. You are the survival version of someone who, once upon a time, had to hide in order to keep existing. Carl Jung once said, "What you resist persists." And that's exactly what the ego does. From childhood, we're taught that certain parts of ourselves should be celebrated and others hidden. If you were too spontaneous and that bothered your parents, you learned to be quiet. If you were sensitive and got called weak, you learned to toughen up. If you were creative and were called weird, you learned to shut up, and each of these lessons left a trail. Today, you live as if you were you, but deep down, you're just defending an image built to protect you. The ego, for Jung, is not the enemy, but it's only the beginning. The problem is that most people never move past it. They get stuck in the role. They confuse the mask with the face. They defend their personality as if it was sacred, not realizing it's just the first layer of many that exist within. That's why so many people live with anxiety, emptiness, disconnection, because they're trying to fulfill themselves through a self that was invented, not discovered. That deep psychological suffering, the one you can't explain in words, that paralyzes you without apparent reason, is born from the fracture between who you are and who you're forcing yourself to be. It's an existential exhaustion from upholding a lie you yourself believe. And it's at this very point that the true path begins. When you realize that the you so proudly defend may be nothing more than an elegant prison with invisible bars and a comfortable rug. Real freedom doesn't begin when you achieve something. It begins when you start doubting who you think you are. This video is an invitation to ruin, an invitation to the collapse of your false identity, because only when it falls does the real you finally have space to be born. Jung called this individuation, but before that, you must tear the veil, look in the mirror, and ask, who is living my life instead of me? You wake up, look in the mirror and think, this is me. But what you see, your expression, your haircut, the way you dress, even the way you walk, is the result of a series of decisions made to be accepted. Carl Jung called this the persona, the psychological mask you wear to function in society. The persona itself isn't the problem. The problem is that you've forgotten it's a mask. The persona is the professional self you present at work, the strong self you post on social media, the pleasant self that survives family dinners. But who are you when no one's watching? Who are you when you're not performing? Most people never find out because the persona has taken over the house. It's no longer a facade, it's become the architect, and without realizing it, you started calling soul what is only performance. The persona is essential to living in society. You need a functional identity. You need to dress, communicate, operate within structures. But when that mask clings to your skin, it kills everything spontaneous, unpredictable, and real. And the worst part, it kills without visible pain. It kills with a smile, because the persona is seductive. It gives you recognition, belonging, praise. It gives you followers, applause, a sense of security, but all of it comes at an unbearable cost, your soul. And when you trade your truth for others' approval, it may look like you're winning, but inside, you're slowly dying in silence. That's why you feel drained even when you haven't done much. That's why you feel lonely even when surrounded by people. That's why compliments don't nourish you and criticism destroys you, because you live dependent on someone else's gaze, a slave to approval. The persona is a filter. It only shows what you want others to see. But the cost of living filtered is that no one will ever truly love you, because no one will ever truly see you. They'll only love the character. And deep down, you start hating that character too, because it protects you, but it also suffocates you. Jung said the persona is an achievement, but also a danger, because the more effective it is, the easier it is to get lost inside it. The doctor who becomes only a doctor, the father who becomes only a father, the influencer who becomes only content, the spiritual leader who becomes only a role. All of them forgot they are more than their functions. And when something pulls them out of that persona, a failure, a betrayal, a loss, they collapse because there's nothing left behind it. Only a void that's been ignored for years. And in that void lives the true self. For Jung, the work of self-discovery requires courage to peel the persona from your skin, and in doing so, to find what was sacrificed so that the mask could exist. Because behind the nice guy, there might be anger. Behind the strong woman, there might be vulnerability. Behind the cold man, there may be a broken heart. And all of that which you hid is exactly what needs to be rescued. Not so you can get lost, but so for the first time, you can become whole. You were raised to fit in. From a very young age, you learn to measure your words, suppress your emotions, hide your most authentic impulses, all in the name of an invisible ideal called good behavior. When you cried too much, they told you it was an overreaction. When you laughed too loud, they told you to be quiet. When you showed curiosity, they looked at you with suspicion. And so, day after day, gesture after gesture, you got the message, being myself isn't safe. And you chose to adapt. You gave up entire parts of yourself just to avoid making waves. You silenced instinct, modulated affection, buried your pain. The vibrant child you once were was replaced by a polite, efficient, praised character, but not a happy one. Because this adapted self you carry to this day was trained to please, not to live. This process is so subtle you hardly notice. You think you're kind, but maybe you just fear confrontation. You think you're rational, but maybe you've only learned to deny what you feel. You think you're reliable, but maybe you just trained yourself to be predictable so you wouldn't lose other people's affection. Everything you call a virtue may actually be a sophisticated defense against abandonment. Jung didn't see this as a flaw, but as a human tragedy. We are pushed to amputate our essence in order to gain approval. And the more applause we receive, the more lost we become. Because that applause isn't for who we are, it's for who we pretend to be. This adapted self acts as a shield. It protects you from rejection, criticism, abandonment, but it also isolates you from real life. Because the truth is, you only feel truly alive when you're whole, with your flaws, your instincts, your impulses and desires. The adapted self constantly asks for permission to exist. It apologizes for feeling too much. It asks to be allowed to be. And the result is a person exhausted, anxious, split, someone who no longer knows whether they're doing what they want or what's expected of them. And when you live like this for too long, the body starts to scream. The mind begins to collapse. Because the soul was never meant to be domesticated. How many times have you said yes when you meant no? How many times have you swallowed tears? How many times have you smiled on the outside while screaming on the inside? That's the cost of the adapted self, a self that functions but doesn't vibrate, that delivers but doesn't feel, that survives but never finds itself. And the cruelest part of all, the world will reward you for it. It will call you mature, balanced, well-adjusted. It will praise your calmness, your control, your performance, and each compliment will bury your true self a little deeper, the one that no longer even remembers how to breathe freely. Jung knew the first step toward healing is realizing how much you've over-adapted, that you built an entire personality out of concessions, and that it's time to rebel against that script, not to destroy everything, but to integrate what was banished, to reclaim the instinct that became guilt, the desire that turned into fear, the strength that became silence, because only when you stop adapting to the gaze of others do you finally begin to be yourself. From the moment you were born, there were eyes watching you. They weren't neutral eyes. They were eyes filled with expectation, fear, projection. The mother projected her ideal child. The father expected a reflection of himself. The family expected obedience, school, discipline, religion, purity, society, efficiency. And before you could even walk, you were already being molded, not to be yourself, but to be acceptable. Every spontaneous gesture was judged, every natural impulse corrected, and in this invisible process you were domesticated, not like a wild animal learning to live among humans, but like a living soul learning to shrink itself in order to fit into a world that only accepts what is convenient. Jung knew the environment shapes the psyche, but he also warned the domestication of the human being comes at a devastating cost. What you now call personality is, to a great extent, a mental survival system forged during childhood. A child's brain absorbs everything as truth. If you were ignored, you learned you didn't matter. If you were punished for expressing anger, you learned to fake a smile. If you were only praised for high grades, you learned you had to perform to earn love. You weren't taught to be yourself. You were trained to obey, to please, to fit in. And this silent conditioning doesn't create a free adult. It creates an anxious one, afraid to make mistakes, guilty for saying no, ashamed of simply being who they are. The domesticated mind operates in I should, I have to, I can't. It turns life into a sequence of emotional protocols. You don't feel, you respond. You don't act, you repeat. Even your most personal choices are shaped by patterns you absorbed before you could think for yourself. That's why, even when you have freedom, you sabotage it. Even when you have options, you freeze. Even when you have desires, you suppress them. Because deep in your mind still lives a scared child trying not to be rejected again. And this training wasn't just psychological, it was physical. Your body also learned to stay silent, to tense up, to lock your chest, to bite your tongue, to clench your stomach. Every cell holds memories of repression, and when the soul tries to rise, through an impulse, a cry, an intuition, the domesticated mind hits the alarm. This is not allowed. And you pull back, you adjust, you go quiet, you disappear, and the cycle continues. Because the one running the domesticated mind isn't you, it's the past. But there is a breaking point, a moment when the soul starts screaming louder than the conditioning, when the emptiness becomes unbearable, when you realize you're living the life others expected from you, not the one you would choose. And then, if you're brave enough, you begin to question, to dismantle, to deconstruct. Jung called this the confrontation with the shadow. But before that comes the rupture with the lie, the brutal recognition that you were trained not to be yourself, and that perhaps the greatest mission of your life is to remember who you were before you had to adapt. You think you're winning when you're praised, when you're called polite, composed, successful. You think you're making it when everyone says you're mature, balanced, strong. But deep down, the price being charged is far too high. Because to maintain that image, that social persona you've built, you have to sacrifice what you truly feel. You have to silence fear, hide desire, deny pain. And slowly, you begin to dim your colors just to fit into a world that only accepts neutral tones. Carl Jung knew this. Every efficient persona requires a caged soul, and the more accepted you are, the farther you drift from yourself. Your inner life starts to rot in silence. Instinct, rage, passion, creative fury, all swallowed by the mask. Have you ever asked yourself why you feel so much boredom? Why life feels grey, even when everything seems in place? Why you feel exhausted on days when nothing happened? It's not a lack of time or of energy. It's a lack of soul. Because living to uphold the persona takes constant effort. It's like being an actor in an endless scene, with the lights on 24 hours a day. And with every minute you pretend to be someone you're not. Your soul hides a little deeper until you forget what it feels like to live with truth. The persona starts as protection and ends as a prison. This process is so disguised that you can go decades without noticing. You can build a career, a family, a legacy, fame, and still wake up in the middle of the night feeling an inexplicable void, because none of it fills the hole left by a soul that was never lived. Jung said the persona is a social contract. You give up a part of yourself to live among others, but when that contract becomes total, you lose the right to be whole. And that's when psychological illnesses appear. The depression with no cause, the constant anxiety, the addictions meant to silence the inner scream. All of it is the echo of a soul silenced in the name of adaptation. The tragedy is that this silencing gets praised, gets rewarded. Society applauds those who fit in, those who don't feel too much, don't complain too much, don't question too much, those who act as if life were a manual, not a mystery. And in this collective theater, you're applauded while dying inside, because the persona doesn't love you. It uses you, it protects you, but charges the price of your vitality. It keeps you socially alive, but steals the only thing that could make you whole, the connection with who you truly are. But there is a way out, and it begins when you stop believing the praise, when you start suspecting that your strength might just be anesthesia, that your peace might be resignation, that your balance might be fear of feeling. The way out begins when you dare to be honest with yourself and admit that the life you're living may not be your own, because only those brave enough to take off the mask can rediscover the face. Imagine living in a house with dozens of rooms, but you've locked most of them. You locked them because they told you it was dangerous. You locked them because you were afraid of what you might find inside. And so you began living in a single room, small, tidy, well-lit, where everything is predictable. That room is the ego. The locked rooms are your shadow. Carl Jung defined the shadow as everything you don't accept in yourself, everything you repress, deny, or forget. But what is denied doesn't disappear, it just hides and waits. The shadow is not evil. The shadow is what you refuse to see, and that's exactly why it holds power over you. Since childhood, we're taught that certain emotions are ugly, that some desires are wrong, that certain thoughts must be banned. So instead of processing them, we bury them. Anger, lock it. Envy, lock it. Vanity, lock it. Fear, lock it. Desire, lock it. And the more we lock away, the more the shadow grows, because the shadow is like a musty basement. The more you ignore it, the more it rots. And that rot begins to leak out where you least expect. It leaks in fits of rage, in addictions you can't break, in self-destructive patterns you repeat without understanding why. The shadow is like a wounded animal. If left untreated, it attacks. You don't have to believe it. Just observe. Notice when you judge someone with disproportionate fury. That person often holds something you deny in yourself. Notice your sabotage patterns. They almost always come from a part of you chose to forget. Notice your relationships. Many conflicts aren't between two people, but between two shadows trying to survive. The truth is brutal. The shadow runs your life while you pretend it doesn't exist. And the more you ignore it, the stronger it becomes. Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." The shadow isn't just the bad in you. It also holds your repressed power, your stifled courage, your ashamed sensuality. your mocked creativity, your ridiculed spirituality, everything denied by the persona ends up in the shadow. And that's why integrating the shadow doesn't make you dark, it makes you whole. It's about reclaiming what is yours, embracing your complexity, shedding the edited character to finally become a real human being. But that takes courage, because facing the shadow hurts. It carries trauma, memories, shame, impulses. It forces you to see that you are not only light and never will be. If you want to be free, you'll have to go down there. Jung compared this process to the myth of the hero descending into the underworld, because the soul must pass through darkness to discover its true light. There is no enlightenment without confrontation. Light is not the opposite of shadow. Light is what dares to touch it. You say you don't understand why you always choose the wrong people, why you get involved in toxic relationships, why you sabotage the good moments, why you repeat patterns you swore you'd never live again. You blame fate, bad luck, other people. But the truth may be darker than you think. What sabotages you isn't out there. It's inside, and it has a name, the shadow. For Jung, the shadow is a second self living deep within your psyche, an excluded, censored self, but still active. It operates behind the scenes of your most important decisions. It chooses for you, loves for you, seeks revenge for you, and in the end, when everything falls apart, you call it a personality issue, not realizing it was just your shadow begging to be seen. The shadow doesn't want to destroy you. It wants to be recognized, but since you reject it, it finds indirect ways to show up. It appears in the anger you can't explain, in the irrational jealousy that overtakes you, in the compulsion you keep trying to control, but always returns, in the saboteurs whispering in your ear, "You're not good enough, you'll fail again, no one truly loves you." These inner voices aren't truths. They're pieces of your psyche that you abandoned, and now they attack you, because that's the only way they know how to survive. What you don't integrate corrodes you, and the more you try to get rid of it, the deeper you sink. Look at your relationships. How many times have you attracted people who awaken the parts of you you try to hide? If you repress your anger, you attract those who provoke it. If you repress your worth, you attract those who belittle you. If you repress desire, you attract those who manipulate you through it. This isn't bad luck, it's the shadow trying to come home, trying to reintegrate. And as long as you keep pointing outward, you'll miss the chance to see what's fragmented inside. Jung said, "What most irritates us in others may be a revelation of what we deny in ourselves." And that revelation is the key to healing, but also the beginning of the collapse of illusion. The shadow doesn't just sabotage your relationships, it sabotages your dreams. Because the fear that paralyzes your actions is often fed by a part of you that believes you don't deserve to succeed, that you're not capable, that you'll fail again. That fear is the voice of the past. It's the wounded child, the humiliated teenager, the frustrated adult, all living in your shadow, screaming through automatic thoughts. And you believe them, because those voices sound like your own consciousness. But they are not your true self. They are fragments, echoes, scars. And you'll only stop being sabotaged when you find the courage to go down there and say, "I see you, and now you are part of me." Integrating the shadow doesn't mean justifying your mistakes. It means reclaiming power. It means no longer living as a victim of impulses you don't understand. It means no longer being a hostage to unnamed trauma. It means finally taking authorship of your own psyche. And that demands inner brutality. It demands facing the monster and realizing it only became monstrous because you left it alone for far too long. The shadow is not born with you. It's created in silence, behind the curtains of your psyche, every time you repress a true emotion. Every time you say, "I can't feel this, I shouldn't be this isn't acceptable." And so, fragment by fragment, it takes shape. The shadow is everything you've swept under the rug of consciousness, not because you wanted to, but because you had to. Because being too authentic, too spontaneous, too emotional was dangerous. The child you once were learned early on that feeling certain things led to punishment, and expressing certain impulses led to rejection. So to survive, you began to hide. And the more you hid, the more you fed the invisible monster. The shadow feeds exactly on what you deny. Carl Jung explained this with brutal clarity. The shadow grows as consciousness retreats. In other words, the less you acknowledge a part of yourself, the stronger it becomes in the unconscious. And this process isn't passive, it's active. You hide fear, and it grows into phobia. You hide desire, and it grows into obsession. You hide anger, and it grows into passive aggression. The shadow doesn't disappear, it changes clothes, and it returns with another voice, a voice that sounds like yours but is distorted. And then you act strangely, explode without reason, sabotage yourself without knowing why, and later say, "I don't know what came over me." What came over you was your shadow, trying to exist, even from the edges. The shadow is like a fogged mirror. It reflects parts of you that were pushed into darkness, but still long for light. When someone irritates you deeply, someone bothers you in an almost irrational way, it's likely they're reflecting a part of yourself you've rejected. That's why the shadow also lives in others. Because everything you repress inside, you project outside. You see in others what you can't yet face in yourself. And that projection is the perfect trap, because while you fight the reflection, you forget to face the mirror. But the shadow isn't made only of sins. It's also made of everything too intense for the world. Your repressed spontaneity, your suffocated power, your feared freedom. The shadow also carries light, but a light that was condemned because it scared people, because it made you different, because it broke social control, and so you chose to hide in order to be accepted. But all repressed light turns into pain. A soul that can't shine rots from the inside, and that's where the emptiness begins, the one you can't seem to fill. Because it's not the world you're missing, it's you. Jung didn't see the shadow as an enemy. He saw it as part of the individuation process. In other words, only those who recognize and integrate their shadow become whole. Those who stop pretending they're only light. Those who have the courage to look within and say, "This is me too." The problem is, almost no one does this. Most prefer to remain anesthetized, reacting to the commands of a split psyche, blaming others, searching for external fixes for internal wounds. But nothing changes until you shift your focus, until you go down into the basement, until you look at yourself in the dark and say, "I came for you." You think you're seeing the other person, but what you're really seeing is yourself. Not the conscious, composed, edited version of yourself, but what's hidden, what you don't want to face, what you swore you weren't. Jung called this projection the unconscious mechanism through which you transfer onto the outer world the inner contents you refuse to accept in yourself. In other words, everything you don't integrate, you project. And the result is devastating. You don't relate to people as they are, but as distorted mirrors of your own shadow. You feel hatred, disgust, repulsion, obsessive admiration, and think it's about them. But it's not. It's about you. Imagine there's rage inside you, rage you never learned how to express. Maybe you were taught that anger was ugly, violent, wrong. So you buried it, hid it. But it didn't die, it simply moved. And now, when you see someone being aggressive, you explode. Not because they deserve all that, but because they triggered the part of you that's locked away. That's how projection works. It turns the other into a stage for your inner wars. And the more you deny a part of yourself, the more intolerant you become toward anyone who expresses it. Projection also happens through praise. That blind admiration, that excessive enchantment with someone, it may be a sign that you're seeing in them a part of yourself you haven't yet dared to live. Their light attracts you because it reflects a light in you, a light you repressed. That's why obsessive love appears, not because the other person is so special, but because they embody something you lost. Projection, then, is not just rejection, it's also idealization, and in both cases, it steals your ability to see reality as it is. The problem with projection isn't just psychological, it's existential, because while you see the world as a screen for your shadow, you move away from truth and away from others. Relationships turn into battlefields where your wounds fight for space. You don't listen, you interpret, you don't dialogue, you react, you don't love, you demand, because everything is being filtered through unresolved, unconscious material. Jung once said, "Know all the theories, master all the techniques, but as you touch a human soul, be just another human soul." And that is only possible when you stop projecting and begin to own what is yours. But how do you know when you're projecting? The first sign is intensity. Whenever something irritates you too much, or charms you too much, or wounds you far beyond proportion, stop, look within, ask, what is this revealing about me? The shadow doesn't speak with logic, it speaks with intensity. And that intensity is the trail that leads you to it. But it takes courage. Because to stop projecting is to admit that the problem was never just the other. That the world, to a great extent, reflects what's unresolved inside you. Undoing projections is a slow but liberating process. It's the path to real relationships, to authentic choices, to a life where you stop blaming others for wounds you alone must heal. Because in the end, the other is just the mirror, and what you see in them is what you haven't yet accepted in yourself. You can ignore your shadow for years. You can deny it, repress it, rationalize it. You can say it doesn't exist, that you've already overcome everything, that you're at peace. But the shadow doesn't need your permission to exist. And the more you deny it, the more power it gains behind the scenes of your mind. Carl Jung warned, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." That means that by repressing your darkness, you're not getting rid of it. You're just handing over the wheel of your life. You're giving the keys of your psyche to a guest you refuse to meet, and when it takes control, you don't even notice. You just feel the chaos. The shadow isn't an external villain. It's your exiled side, abandoned, unacknowledged, and when you don't integrate it consciously, it seeps into your choices, your words, your actions. It's what makes you ruin relationships out of pride, sabotage achievements out of fear, seek punishment when you should seek healing. The shadow is the silent saboteur living in your routine, and because you don't see it, you think the world is the problem, that people are against you, that life is unfair. But the truth is, you're being manipulated by a part of yourself you refuse to recognize. Denying your darkness doesn't make you enlightened, it makes you blind. And that blindness is dangerous, because when you can't see yourself, you start becoming cruel to others. Internal repression turns into external judgment. Contained anger becomes masked violence. Unfaced fear turns into control over those around you. Jung said that what you repress in yourself, you end up imposing on others. That's why so many good people end up doing harm, because goodness without shadow becomes moralism, and moralism is the perfect mask for hypocrisy. Those who think they're too pure are often possessed by a shadow disguised as virtue. The shadow also retaliates. When ignored for too long, it finds brutal ways to appear through crisis, an emotional breakdown, an unexpected breakup, an addiction that explodes, a psychosomatic illness. All of it may be the soul screaming for attention. It's not bad luck. It's not punishment. It's a call. It's the shadow saying, stop pretending. The danger isn't in feeling the shadow, it's in pretending it doesn't exist. Because that denial doesn't just poison your mind, it poisons your soul. Integrating darkness isn't surrendering to chaos. It's making space within so that chaos can become consciousness. It's acknowledging anger and learning to channel it as strength. It's facing fear and turning it into awareness. It's listening to pain and turning it into compassion. The danger of the shadow lies only in its exile, in the distance, the silence, the refusal. As long as it's kept away, it will keep running the show beneath the surface. True light is not the absence of shadow. It is the courage to walk alongside it. You believe there's a unique voice within you, that when you think, choose, feel, you're acting as a coherent, unified, aligned self. But the truth is far more complex. Carl Jung knew this. You are not a single unit, you are a multiplicity. You are an inner council made up of different voices, archetypes, and psychological characters, constantly competing for control over your choices. Sometimes you act as the caretaker, other times as the saboteur. In some moments, the hero, in others, the victim. And what you call a personal decision is often just the echo of the character who shouted the loudest at that moment. That's why you contradict yourself. That's why you regret, backtrack, change your mind. It's not weakness, it's complexity. There are parts of you that want to grow, and others that want to stay safe. There are fragments that long to love, and others that fear being hurt again. There's a you that wants change, and another you that only wants to survive. This internal multitude is not a flaw, it is the human condition. Jung called it the plurality of the psyche, and understanding this is essential to growth, because as long as you believe you are only one, you will keep hating yourself for being contradictory. You'll punish yourself for lacking willpower. You'll judge yourself for not knowing what you feel. But the problem was never about clarity, it was about reconciliation. You don't need to get rid of your parts, you need to listen to them. Give space to the inner child still crying for attention. Name the inner critic that demands perfection. Acknowledge the protector that anticipates pain. Hear the rebel that wants to break everything. Inside you live voices that fear, that rage, that dream. And they won't go away just because you pretend they're not there. Quite the opposite. The more you ignore them, the louder they scream. And those screams show up as anxiety, indecision, burnout. The emotional chaos you feel doesn't come from outside. It comes from the civil war within. The path then is to become a mediator, an inner leader, someone who doesn't choose by impulse but by integration, someone who listens to all the voices and decides with awareness. Jung said that maturity is ceasing to be possessed by a part of the psyche and starting to coordinate them all. That's not easy. Some voices are convincing, seductive. The voice of fear often sounds like prudence, the voice of ego like confidence, the voice of attachment like love. But if you don't develop deep listening, you'll be manipulated by inner voices that don't represent your essential self, only fragments that survive trauma. You are not fear, but you must listen to it. You are not anger, but you must understand it. You are not doubt, but it has something to teach, because all those voices were formed with a purpose, to protect you, to remind you, to prepare you. And if you learn to integrate instead of fight, you become whole. Someone who can choose with clarity, act with strength, and feel with freedom, because you're no longer being hijacked by a single inner voice, but guided by the totality of who you are. You think you're free, that you think for yourself, feel for yourself, choose for yourself. But what Carl Jung discovered is something deeply unsettling. There are invisible forces within you that were not created by you, but inherited. They are the archetypes, universal psychological structures, patterns as ancient as humanity itself, that shape the way you see the world, others, and yourself. You are not born empty. You are born with a symbolic map within. And it is this map that molds how you love, fear, fight, flee, desire, and suffer. Archetypes aren't made-up characters. They are psychic realities that exist across all cultures. In every civilization, there have been myths of the hero, the mother, The wise old man, the rebel, the innocent, the shadow, the anima, the tyrant father, the devouring great mother. These patterns are not a coincidence. They reside in the collective unconscious, a deep layer of the mind you share with all of humanity. Jung discovered that these archetypes are activated within you depending on the phases of your life, the traumas you endure, the challenges you face. And when an archetype takes over, you begin to live as if you were a myth in flesh and blood. For example, when you face a great obstacle, you might be overtaken by the hero archetype. You feel the need to prove your worth, to fight against everything and everyone, even without understanding why you're so obsessed with victory. Or, on the flip side, you might be dominated by the victim, seeing only injustice, repeating, "Why me?" refusing to act because you believe the whole world is against you. In a relationship, you may activate the anima or animus, idealizing the other as your lost half, setting unrealistic expectations, confusing love with symbolic dependency. That's not just emotion. It's the activation of an archetypal psychic structure. And the more unconscious you are, the more dominated you become by these patterns. Archetypes don't ask for permission. They simply find cracks in your psyche and take shape. An absent father may trigger the seeker archetype. A deep trauma may throw you into the path of the wounded. Sudden success may evoke the tyrant. Your mood shifts, your posture changes, your narrative transforms. But in truth, you're just playing the role that the archetype demands in that moment. Most people spend their entire lives trapped in 2 or 3 dominant archetypes, reenacting the same emotional scenes with different characters. The secret isn't to destroy the archetypes, it's to know them, identify them. Notice when you're being possessed by one. Jung said that individuation, the process of becoming who you are, necessarily involves recognizing the archetypes that inhabit you. Because only when you recognize what is universal can you discover what is truly unique. Archetypes are molds, but your soul is one of a kind, and only those who know the molds they've been cast into can break them. Psychological freedom isn't the absence of patterns. It's awareness of the patterns that live inside you. It's knowing that within you lives the warrior and the fragile one, the noble and the saboteur, the nurturing mother and the suffocating mother, and that each of these inner figures has something to teach, but none of them should take over completely, because at the center of all this, there is you. Not the you that was tamed, not the you shaped by society, but the you that emerges when you can look each of these archetypes in the eye and say, "I see you, but I'm the one choosing now." You are on stage, all the time, and without realizing it, you repeat old lines, react with rehearsed gestures, act as if life were an invisible script written by someone else. But the author of that script isn't the world, nor fate. It's your unconscious. Carl Jung showed that all of us, to varying degrees, live trapped in psychological roles, archetypes that settle into our emotional system and guide our behavior without us noticing. They are roles we inherited, learned, absorbed from culture, from childhood, from pain. And over time, we stop being people and become characters. One of the most common and most celebrated is the hero, the one who wants to win, overcome, prove their worth. The hero is strong, determined, brave, but also obsessed, rigid, incapable of showing vulnerability. They don't rest, don't accept defeat, can't tolerate failure. And when life knocks them down, as it inevitably does, they collapse. Because they never learned how to be human, only how to be a winner. And so, what began as strength turns into a prison. The hero believes they're succeeding, but inside, they're always exhausted and alone. On the other side lives the coward, the one who runs, who hesitates, who freezes, The coward was wounded too early, judged, exposed, humiliated, and now every time life calls, they answer with fear. They prefer to hide, to justify, to protect themselves. But the cruelest part is that they hide behind logical arguments. It's not the right time. I'm not ready. That's not for me. But behind all of it, there's panic. And the more the coward is in charge, the more life passes by without being lived. In another corner of your psyche, the victim lives. They don't want to win. They just want to be seen. They want someone to say, "You're right, life was unfair to you." And sometimes it really was. But the victim clings to pain as an identity, feeds suffering like it's a badge of honor, repeats the story of abandonment, rejection, failure, and demands that the world recognize them for it. The problem is that once the victim takes over, it paralyzes you. You stop trying because you've already decided you'll always be hurt. And so you live with anger, resentment, sorrow, but you don't move. And finally, the savior. Perhaps the most disguised of them all, the one who lives for others, who helps too much, gives too much, understands everything, accepts everything. The savior seems noble, but most of the time, they're trying to rescue themselves in others. They need someone to need them, need to fix the world so they don't have to face their own emptiness. And so they lose themselves in abusive relationships, impossible projects, causes that consume them. They sacrifice, but they charge a high price for it. They demand affection, recognition, control. And when they don't receive it, they sink into the silent frustration of someone who gave everything and was never truly seen. These roles aren't flaws, they're mechanisms, internal structures that activate in response to wounds, desires, and fears. The problem is when you identify too strongly with one of them and forget that you are much more than that. You are not only the hero, nor only the victim. You are not just the coward, nor only the savior. You are the stage where all of these characters try to exist. And true freedom begins when you realize that, when you stop being ruled and start choosing. Jung didn't want you to destroy your roles. He wanted you to recognize them, to know when you're being guided by an old trauma, by a childhood need, by an impossible ideal. And that, upon realizing it, you could take a breath and say, "Thank you, character, but now I choose." Inside every man, there is an invisible woman. Inside every woman, there is a hidden man. Not a biological man, not a physical woman, but a deep psychic principle, an archetypal force that shapes how you love, create, think, and relate. Carl Jung called these forces anima and animus. The anima is the feminine principle of the psyche, present in a man's unconscious. The animus is the masculine principle, operating in a woman's unconscious. They are not just metaphors. They are living structures that manifest through dreams, creative impulses, relationships, and inner conflicts. And if you've never seen them, it's because they've been guiding you without your awareness. The anima, when integrated, connects a man to sensitivity, intuition, empathy, and spontaneous creativity. She is the bridge to the soul, the force that teaches him to feel deeply, to listen without fixing, to dive into the invisible. But when the anima is repressed or distorted, she takes on dangerous forms: hysteria, emotional instability, obsessive idealization of the feminine, emotional dependence. The man starts to search outside himself for the woman he has denied within. And so he gets lost in platonic love, unbalanced relationships, emotional idolatry. It's not love, it's archetypal longing. And until he integrates his anima, he'll keep looking for half of himself in someone else. On the other side, the animus represents, for the woman, logic, action, reason, and direction. He is the force that connects her to the courage to say no, to assertiveness, to the power of decision. When integrated, the animus makes her centered, firm, and clear. But when unconscious or inflated, he becomes a tyrant. She starts hearing inner voices that judge her, demand perfection, dismiss vulnerability, or she projects, seeking in the external man the father, the guide, the savior, and she confuses love with authority. It's not admiration, it's surrendering her center. And until she integrates her animus, she'll keep swinging between submission and rigidity. These inner forces do not follow gender rules. A man may have a well-developed anima and thus be sensitive, creative, compassionate without being less of a man. A woman may have a strong animus and therefore lead, build, speak firmly without being less feminine. Because true balance doesn't lie in conforming to expectations, but in integrating the wholeness of who you are. And as long as you reject one pole, you'll live in imbalance, seeking outside what is missing inside, craving in others what you haven't yet embraced in yourself. The anima and the animus are not flaws to be corrected. They are powers to be welcomed. Jung said the encounter with these inner figures was inevitable. In dreams, in relationships, in emotional breakdowns, they appear even disguised, asking to be seen, and your mission is not to expel them, but to dance with them, to listen to what they have to say. Because every time you repress one of these principles, you're repressing half of your soul, and no soul survives in halves. Integrating the animus and the anima is an act of courage. It's looking at the other, man, woman, partner, not as a missing piece that saves you, but as a mirror that reveals you. It's accepting that sensitivity doesn't weaken a man, that firmness doesn't dehumanize a woman, that being whole is far more subversive than being proper, and that in the silence of the psyche, we are all made of the same substance, light, shadow, strength, and love. You are not alone within yourself. You are inhabited by voices that are not entirely yours. Voices that come from long before your personal story began. They carry the fears, myths, desires, and wounds of thousands of generations that lived before you were born. Carl Jung called this deep dimension of the mind the collective unconscious, a psychic reservoir shared by all human beings where the archetypal experiences of humanity are stored. It's not a personal memory, it's an ancestral memory. A deep layer of the psyche where you are not an individual, you are humanity. Within the collective unconscious live universal symbols, birth, death, rebirth, the mother, the father, the hero, the enemy, the shadow, the guide. These are not just concepts. They are living psychic structures that influence you from the moment you're born. When you dream of falling, of an ocean, of a labyrinth, you're not merely reflecting something personal, you're accessing a symbol shared across the entire species. Jung discovered that people from completely distinct cultures, with no contact between them, produced similar images in dreams and myths, because deep down, we all walk on the same symbolic ground. And that ground is more powerful than you think, because it shapes your deepest impulses, the way you feel fear, how you deal with the unknown, how you interpret love, loss, failure, redemption. None of this is purely rational. All of it is filtered through the collective unconscious. That's why certain films touch you so deeply, why certain books transform you, why certain archetypes, like the hero, the mother, or the sage, move you without you even knowing why. They speak to a part of you that exists beyond the ego, a part that is ancestral, mythical, primitive, and real. The collective unconscious is also the field where traumas are perpetuated. If your lineage endured wars, repression, exclusion, all of that still vibrates within you, even if you're unaware of it. You might be living with a fear that didn't begin with you, a block that isn't yours but inherited, a guilt that stretches far back. Jung didn't see this as superstition, but as structure. The collective unconscious is a system, and your psyche is just one of its manifestations. Recognizing this doesn't strip away your individuality, it deepens it. It helps you understand that you're part of something far greater, that your dreams are not just yours, that your fears have deeper roots, that your choices carry at times centuries of silence, and that the path of individuation is not just about self-knowledge, it's a path of reconnection with humanity, with myths, with symbols, with the sacred that lives in the psyche. Jung once said, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakens." And when you truly look within, you find a forest. And in that forest, voices that belong to all time. The collective unconscious is not your enemy. It is soil, source, origin. But it can also be a prison if you don't realize it's there. Because those who live under the domination of archetypal patterns without recognizing them end up repeating old stories, dramas that aren't theirs, decisions already made, destinies already set. But when you shine light on that field, you become an author. And you cease to be just another character in the human story, and become someone who, from within the story, dared to write a new chapter. There comes a moment in life, silent, intimate and non-transferable, when all the masks fall, when the external voices go quiet, when the noise of daily life can no longer drown out the call rising from within. It's in that instant that you come face to face with the self. Not the social I, the adapted I or the wounded I, but the deep center of your psyche, the living totality that watches everything, including your characters. Carl Jung called the self this sacred instance of the soul that does not confuse itself with the ego or with the roles you've learned to play. The self doesn't want you to win, it wants you to be awaken. And that awakening only happens when you have the courage to strip away everything that is not you. The self is who you truly are, when no one is watching. It's the silent awareness behind emotion, the presence that survives your stories, the essence that flows through your identities. It is the union of what you show and what you hide, of what you accept and what you reject, of what you're proud of and what you wish to forget. It lies not in the light nor in the shadow, but in the integration. The self does not demand purity. It demands truth. And that's why it's so difficult to access. Because first, you must cross the ego, face the shadow, recognize the archetype, silence the noise, and only then maybe touch this quiet core that pulses within you from the very beginning. The encounter with the self is not a mystical enlightenment or a sudden ecstasy. It's a firm and non-negotiable clarity. It's the moment when you stop defining yourself by what you have, by what you do, by what others say, and start existing as presence, as someone who no longer needs to prove anything, because you deeply know who you are. This encounter doesn't come from logic. It comes from the courage to empty yourself, to let the constructed image die, to abandon characters, speeches, labels, and stand naked before yourself. Jung said the self is like the sun of the psyche. It is always there, even when it's cloudy. The problem is that the ego wants to occupy that place. It wants to be the center, to command. And so it resists the self with all its might. It creates distractions, feeds stories, justifies addictions, idealizes goals. It does everything to avoid the silence where the self lives. And as long as you remain identified with the ego, the self will seem like a distant idea, an abstraction. But the self doesn't need to be believed in, it needs to be lived. And it reveals itself in the simplest of moments, in the cry you finally allow, in the no you say without guilt, in the hug where you don't pretend, in the presence where you're not trying to impress anyone. In these small deaths of the ego, the self blooms. The encounter with the self is also the beginning of a new responsibility. Because once you know who you are, you can no longer live as if you don't. You can no longer pretend. You can no longer betray yourself. You may still fall, but you'll know you're falling. You may still err, but you'll no longer hide behind excuses. Because the self doesn't ask for perfection. It asks for wholeness, and that changes everything, because life stops being a performance and becomes an expression. You stop searching for meaning and begin to live as if you were the meaning itself. This is the true rebirth, not a new you, but the return to what has always been there, behind the fear, the pain, the persona, the shadow. The self is what remains when everything that is not you finally crumbles. Carl Jung didn't believe in cheap happiness. He didn't promise quick formulas or easy paths. What Jung offered was a journey, long, painful, brutal, but absolutely necessary. A journey he called individuation. The psychological process through which a human being stops being a copy, a mask, a reflection of the collective, and becomes someone truly unique. Not unique out of vanity, but out of wholeness. Individuation is the crossing from ego to self, from unconsciousness to light, from character to soul. And it doesn't begin with answers. It begins with questions that tear you apart. Who am I when no one applauds me? What remains when everything I've repressed comes to the surface? Who's living my life in my place? These questions don't come with ready-made answers, but they open portals. And from the moment you accept them, the journey begins. First comes the confrontation with the persona, the social mask you learn to wear in order to survive. You begin to realize you're not what you show, nor what others expect. You start to question the labels, the roles, the praise, and that collapse is painful because the persona is comfortable, it's admired, but it's also a cage. And to be free, you'll have to break it down with your own hands. Then comes the shadow, that dark, chaotic, repressed part, but deeply alive. The shadow doesn't want to be destroyed. It wants to be recognized. And you'll need to face everything you've avoided your whole life. The anger, the fear, the desire, the resentment. You'll need to listen to the voice of the child you abandoned, the teenager you shamed, the adult you censored. You'll have to say, I see you. And in that moment, the shadow stops being an enemy and becomes an ally. Then come the archetypes, the inner myths that dominated you without you even realizing it. The exhausted hero, the resentful victim, the compulsive savior, the ashamed coward, the inner tyrant demanding perfection. All of these characters will show up, and you'll have to walk through them like someone crossing a dark forest, not to deny them, but to know they're there. And only then, you'll be able to choose. Because only those who recognize their own impulses are truly free to choose. Individuation is not a final destination. It's a state of growing awareness. It's living with open eyes. Knowing there are multiple voices inside you, but you don't need to obey them all. It's acting with clarity, feeling with responsibility, loving without losing yourself, failing without destroying yourself, existing without having to explain yourself, because you no longer live to please, to compensate, or to hide. You live because you are whole. This journey has no map, no straight line. It's a spiral. Sometimes you return to the same place, but with different eyes. Sometimes you fall again, but now you understand why you fell. And each time the cycle repeats, a little more of your soul is revealed. Jung said, individuation is the realization of the self. In other words, the blooming of what you've always been, but had to lose in order to rediscover. In the end, individuation is not about becoming something new. It's about remembering what has always been there. Behind the stories, the wounds, the masks, you weren't born to be the same, or to live anesthetized. You were born to be whole, and the path to that is the bravest dive anyone can take, the dive within. You want to change, you want to heal, you want to live with more truth, more presence, more lightness. But what almost no one tells you, and what Carl Jung always knew, is that true healing is not a remedy. It is a death, not a physical death, but a symbolic death, an inner collapse, a deep rupture with everything you believed yourself to be. True healing demands that something in you dies. The inflated ego, the dishonest persona, the inherited roles, the masks that protected you for a lifetime. All of that must fall. It must bleed. It must rot and be buried, because there is no rebirth without mourning, and there is no awakening without sacrifice. You don't heal by becoming more positive, nor by repeating mantras, nor by ignoring your pain. You heal when you accept collapse, when you allow your inner structure, the one that held up your most polished lies, to finally break. Because only in the dust, only in the wreckage, only in the dark night of the soul does truth emerge. Truth doesn't shout, it whispers, after everything else goes silent. And that silence only happens after symbolic death, after you stop explaining yourself, justifying yourself, trying to mentally make sense of everything. Healing is an end, and only after the end comes the beginning. This death is not voluntary. No one wakes up saying, "Today I want to die inside." It arrives as crisis, as loss, as rupture, as a sequence of events that feel unfair but are, in truth, stripping you down. Symbolic death is the divorce that forces you to face your loneliness, the bankruptcy that reveals your dependence on validation, the betrayal that exposes your illusion, the depression that crushes your cheerful persona, the breakdown that unmasks your identity, and you suffer, you rage, you feel lost. But if you have the courage to go through it, without running, without numbing, without pretending, you are reborn. Because on the other side of that death, there is no character left, only you. No makeup, no armor, no shield, and it is in this lucid ruin that you begin to truly live. Healing is not going back to who you used to be. It's discovering who you were never allowed to be. And for that, the old you will have to die. The you who pleases, the you who persuades, the you who self-sabotages. Every layer will fall, and it will hurt, because you clung to them, because they once protected you, but now they're suffocating you, and it's time to let them go. Jung knew that the soul does not evolve through comfort. It evolves through confrontation, and the most brutal confrontation is with who you've been. It's when you look at everything you built, your career, your image, your story, and admit, "This is not me." That is death. The moment when the old no longer fits, but the new hasn't arrived yet. A psychological limbo, a mapless crossing, but an absolutely sacred one, because only those who allow themselves to die are ready to be born again. True healing is not a destination, it is a cyclical process. You will die and be reborn many times. You will lose your faith and find it again in another form. You will stop believing in certainties and discover something far greater. Truth is not a sentence, it is a state of being, and you only arrive there when everything that is not you finally collapses. You fear solitude, you avoid it, you cover it with noise, with distraction, with fragile bonds and momentary voids. You keep your phone in hand, your schedule full, your mind busy, also you don't have to hear what silence reveals. But Carl Jung understood what most people refuse to accept. Solitude is not punishment, it is a portal. It doesn't come to punish you. It comes to return you to yourself, because only when the world goes quiet can you finally hear what your soul has always been trying to say. Deep solitude, not the absence of company, but the intense presence of the self, is the fertile ground where the self sprouts, where individuation begins to root, where rebirth finds space to emerge. It is in solitude that the masks lose their meaning, that the automatic answers stop, that social roles collapse, because there is no one left to impress, no one to please, no one to keep the performance going. There is only you, facing yourself. And in that naked mirror, you begin to realize how much you've betrayed yourself, how much you've hidden, how much of life slipped through your fingers for fear of not being accepted. Silence reveals not only what you feel, but what you've lost. And it's in that morning, not for something external, but for yourself, that the reunion happens. Solitude, however, is terrifying because it forces you to stop being someone for the world and start being someone for yourself. It pulls you out of the addiction to validation, away from applause, away from the emotional dependencies that made you feel needed. Jung once said, "Loneliness does not mean being alone, but being with oneself." And being with yourself takes courage, because you'll have to face your mess, your noise, your emptiness. You'll have to clean the house of your soul, and that is painful. But it's only in that clean space that essence can enter. It is in solitude that the shadow reveals itself most powerfully. It appears the moment you stop running. But that's not a curse. It's an opportunity. Because only those who have the courage to walk through their own dark night discover the light that comes from within. And that light is not euphoria, it's not excitement, it is peace. A peace that depends on no one, that doesn't shatter in absence, that doesn't beg for presence. A peace that is born when you become enough for yourself. But modern culture taught us to fear solitude, to treat it as failure, as a sign that something is wrong. But for Jung, and for every soul in search of itself, solitude is initiation. It is the desert before the vision, the abyss before the flight, the silence before the revelation. Every great individuation process demands withdrawal, a break from the collective, from the crowd, from the noise, because the self doesn't speak loudly, it whispers, and to hear it, you need silence. Solitude is not absence, it is full presence. It is not abandonment, it is return. It is not emptiness, it is the space where something new can be born, and you only understand that when you stop asking others to fill you and start filling yourself with truth. Because in the end, the only company you will never be able to escape is your own. And until you learn how to be with it, you will always, even surrounded by people, be completely alone. The end has come, but not an end in the usual sense. An end in the Jungian sense. An end that is, in truth, a beginning. After diving into the persona, confronting the shadow, identifying the archetypes, visiting the collective unconscious, and facing the self, what remains is you. But not the version of you shaped to please, nor the one too wounded to feel, nor the one who keeps repeating stories that aren't theirs. What remains is what you were able to integrate. Because in the end, you are not your name, your history, your trauma, your achievements. You are what you managed to embrace without breaking, what you were able to see without fleeing, what you were able to feel without losing yourself. Carl Jung taught us that true identity is not a label. It's a process of reconciliation between the parts, ego with the unconscious, light with shadow, masculine with feminine, pain with love, reason with symbol. Everything you separated out of fear must be united through courage. The soul doesn't seek purity, it seeks wholeness. And the whole human is not the one who overcame everything, but the one who walked through it without denying anything. Not the one who won every battle, but the one who returned from them more lucid, more compassionate, more present. You spend your life trying to answer, "Who am I?" And you believe the answer lies in beautiful phrases, in titles, in fixed identities. But the true I is not a fixed point. It is movement. You are what transforms, what heals, what is revealed. You are what you were able to include. Even the parts you swore would never be part of you. Jung said, "Becoming conscious is unpopular work because it involves pain, but it is this very work that sets you free, because once you integrate everything you are, no one can manipulate you anymore. Not others, not culture, not fear." This final revelation is not an explosion. It is a deep silence, a state of presence where you no longer need to defend yourself, or prove yourself, or hide. Because now you know everything in you has a place, everything has a function, everything belongs. And when that happens, you stop reacting and start creating. You create with truth. You create with awareness. You create not to be accepted, but because you simply can no longer live outside your essence. You are not your trauma, but it's part of you. You are not your mistake, but it taught you. You are not the pain you lived, but it gave you depth. You are all of that, and more. Because now, you're no longer trying to erase what built you. You're embracing it, integrating it, unifying it. The self does not demand perfection. The self demands lucidity. And the lucidity of someone who made it this far can be summed up in a single truth. I am what I can hold within myself without betraying who I am. At the end of the journey, there is no new you. There is the real you, who has always been there waiting for you to have the courage to come home. You've spent your life trying to be someone, trying to please, to succeed, to fit in, but maybe the real journey was never about conquering the world, but about conquering yourself. Carl Jung didn't give you ready-made answers. He gave you a map to the invisible, an invitation to dive in the only direction that truly transforms, inward. Because everything you're looking for, clarity, love, presence, meaning, isn't out there. It's at the center of your own soul. And that center only reveals itself when you stop running from what you feel and start walking with all that you are. You don't need to become perfect. You don't need to eliminate pain. You don't need to erase the past. You just need the courage to look, to listen, to embrace, because true freedom doesn't lie in erasing parts of yourself. It lies in including them all. And when you manage to do that, you'll stop seeking approval. You'll stop sabotaging yourself. You'll stop repeating the same patterns, because for the first time, you'll be whole. And only those who are whole can walk with truth. If this video truly spoke to you, share it. Door, not because we need numbers, but because the world needs awareness. Comment below. What did you see in yourself while listening to Jung? What part of you is asking to be integrated right now? Subscribe to the channel to continue this journey of depth, courage, and clarity. This channel is for those who are done pretending, for those who no longer accept living anesthetized, for those who chose to look within, even if it hurts. Sati, because only when you stop running do you begin to be free.